Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, July 20th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, federal data helps drive everything from economic forecasts to local planning decisions. Now a new Commerce Department policy has experts debating how government should balance privacy, transparency, and access to information. Plus, artificial intelligence may be getting the attention, but AI is only as reliable as the data behind it. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Senate lawmakers are calling for an independent audit of the Defense Department's multi-billion-dollar TRICARE pharmacy program amid concerns that its longtime contractor, Express Scripts, may have a financial incentive to steer beneficiaries toward its own pharmacies. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more details. Anastasia, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Terry.
What exactly is Congress concerned about here?
Yeah, so we have Express Scripts, the contractor that manages the TRICARE pharmacy program, as the pharmacy benefit manager. And we will probably touch a little bit on this. The way it's set up is a little different from commercial PBM models, and DoD essentially calls itself the PBM. But as the manager, Express Scripts decides which pharmacies can participate in the network, and it also decides reimbursement rates. However, the company also operates its own mail order and specialty pharmacies that participate in the TRICARE network. That, of course, puts it in direct competition with other pharmacies in the network, and some lawmakers have been raising concerns about this potential conflict of interest. Here's Senator Elizabeth Warren.
That means that Express Scripts both provides pharmacy services to TRICARE members directly and sets the reimbursement rates for itself and all of its competitors. That gives Express Scripts an incentive to under-reimburse all of the competing pharmacies and inflate its own payments. So, how is that deal working out for the taxpayers? Express Scripts reportedly charged DoD $484 more on average for generic drugs dispensed by the Express Scripts owned pharmacy. Meanwhile, Express Scripts has offered unaffiliated pharmacies such terrible terms that since 2022, nearly 13,000 retail pharmacies have just left the TRICARE network. They've just said, we can't be part of this.
Anastasia, Express Scripts has been the contractor here for over 20 years. Why is this a concern now?
Yeah, just like you mentioned, they've been administering TRICARE pharmacy benefits for like 23 years. But in 2021, they win this 8-year contract worth up to $4.3 billion. And this new contract allowed Express Scripts to reduce the minimum number of in-network pharmacies from 50,000 to 35,000. So since then, Express Scripts proposed reduced reimbursement rates and basically pushed a lot of pharmacies out. As a result, like Elizabeth Warren mentioned, about 13 to 15,000 pharmacies exited the network, and most of them serve like rural areas, and it's been a big issue. Here's Dr. Michael Lanford. He owns a pharmacy in New Mexico, which is close to the Air Force Base.
After ESI was awarded the T-Farm 5 contract, they drastically reduced their reimbursement rates, such that I would have lost almost $9 on every prescription I filled before overhead, before any other expense. That would have been catastrophic for our business's viability and for all the other patients that we serve. No contractor should be allowed to referee a game while also competing in it. Military families experience the consequences while the contractor reports that the system is working just fine. Congress can and should correct this, require an independent audit, measure real pharmacy access, require transparent and sustainable reimbursement, protect patient choice, and establish conflict of interest safeguards that require a non-vertically integrated manager.
It's very complicated. However, DoD wouldn't release the terms of their contract with Express Scripts to Congress, saying that information is proprietary. So Congress doesn't know the terms. But the lawmakers obtained a copy of the contract that pharmacies were required to sign back in 2022 to remain in the TRICARE network. So one of the provisions in the contract basically allows the contractor, Express Scripts, to adjust what the contractor pays pharmacies after a claim has been processed. Express Scripts denies any involvement in practices like spread pricing, which is basically charging the insurer one price, paying the pharmacy a different price, and then keeping that difference. Here is Greg Raybould. He is the vice president of the American Pharmacy Cooperative.
What I would say is that is, in about 20 years of practicing law, that might be the biggest smoking gun document I've seen in a hearing, right? Because what that means is they get to do post-adjudication offsets. So what they reimburse a pharmacy at the point of sale, they get to move it around. What I would say is this. When you take that provision, which gives them the right to move money around after the fact across plans, it's essentially we're talking about what? A complex shell game. We're talking about a Fortune 20 company playing a shell game that you see on the street corner in any city.
So, Anastasia, what has DoD said in response? Those are some pretty significant claims.
No, absolutely. So first of all, DoD requires the contractor administering the TRICARE pharmacy benefit to also operate its own pharmacy services. So this kind of vertical integration. They're also saying that this contract is different from civilian models. DHA uses a pharmacy benefit administrator rather than a traditional pharmacy benefit manager. It essentially calls itself a PBM, and the DHA pays the contractor a fixed fee per prescription filled. So they're saying they can't really generate revenue from price of drugs themselves. However, there's a lot of pushback, and we talked a little bit about it. Let me give you an example. So, for example, mail order pharmacy, it's about $14 copay for a 90-day supply, and you have retail pharmacy, it's about $16 copay for a 30-day supply. So, as a customer, you're like, okay, good deal. But the reimbursement picture is different. Express Scripts reimburses its own mail order pharmacies at the full statutory ceiling of $14, but they're reimbursing retail pharmacies sometimes as low as 65 cents per prescription. So that's kind of the issue.
What do you think happens next? Will the Senate direct an audit?
So yeah, they want a full audit. Actually, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs promised the committee to conduct an annual review of the contract, but Congress is still waiting. So the Senate Armed Services Committee put that requirement in the fiscal 2027 NDAA. The Defense Department is also planning the next generation TRICARE pharmacy contract. So lawmakers want full transparency on this program, and they also want DoD to flatly prohibit vertical integration in the next contract. So it theoretically provides coordinated care, but of course it creates this conflict of interest that we were talking about.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Thanks for bringing us this story.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find the full details in her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, federal data helps drive everything from economic forecasts to local planning decisions. Now, a new Commerce Department policy has experts debating how government should balance privacy, transparency, and access to information. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Most Americans never think about the statistical methods used to protect personal information in federal data products. But a recent Commerce Department order is raising questions about how agencies will balance privacy protections with the need to publish useful public data. Joining me with his concerns is Paul Schroeder, Executive Director of the Council of Professional Associations on Federal Statistics. Mr. Schroeder, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start this conversation at a fairly high level. The Department of Commerce issued an order last month dealing with how federal statistical agencies protect confidential information. What's this order all about, and what prompted it?
So this order essentially says that to protect confidential information, the Department of Commerce, which includes Census and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, is limited to either coarsening or suppressing data. Suppressing data means it's simply not released at certain levels, and coarsening means that it's released at very high levels of analysis. So think states instead of county level data. We don't know what the impetus for this order was. There has been a lot of controversy around what they call noise infusion and particularly differential privacy, which we'll probably get into a little later. But that is, this is the order that came out, and what our statement did, it was have a real problem with the way it was developed and the way it just came out without any public input.
And how does this relate to the president's executive order on restoring the gold standard of science? There are certain statistical standards here. Is this compliant?
I would say it's not, largely because science should be a transparent and reproducible enterprise. And issuing orders like this without really cause or justification really threatens that trust and integrity of federal science. And that's something that we're very concerned about.
And people rely on census and BEA data probably without realizing it. Just give us a couple of examples of broader measures or functionality that might be impacted by this kind of rule.
Sure. So there's a lot of economic data sets that are affected. The Census Bureau itself has an economic directorate that collects a lot of economic data that a lot of business owners and folks use. So, for example, if you wanted to open up a new restaurant, say in Montgomery County, you're not really going to care about the average disposable income of those, say in Western Maryland, or even in the average for the state of Maryland. You want to know about your county and your neighborhood. You really want to make sure that you don't care about, let's say, John Smith is spending on going out to eat, but you care about what folks in the community are doing. And that's the problem with this order. We don't know how it affects data sets that will give that information to folks that's collected by the federal government.
And you said you were concerned with the process by which this rule was developed and publicized. Tell me more.
Yeah, so the rule just came down. There was no notice about it. No one knew about it, including those within the agencies that it affects. I won't say no one, but a lot of people were caught off guard in those agencies, and certainly those of us who use public data on a regular basis were caught off guard. Typically, these sorts of rules that are going to affect a lot of data and a lot of research are put through the Federal Register, and there's an open comment period for people to put input. There's a discussion about it, and there's more explanation about why this rule came about, and that was all lacking in this case.
Well, certainly privacy protection and data collection is a hot topic. We hear a lot of concerns about identity theft and exposure of private data. So when you're thinking about that, supporters of stronger privacy protections would say the government has an obligation to keep that data private. Does this rule take advantage of advances in computing and artificial intelligence that would expand privacy protections, or does it not?
No, it does not. In fact, it dials back the clock. So there's been a lot of technology that has come out in the past 20, even 30 years that reduces things like noise infusion, where we infuse a certain amount of noise into the data, which doesn't affect the aggregate statistic or estimate very much, and also protects the privacy of those individuals who are within the data set. The issue with privacy is that people can use linking mechanisms to outside data sets, which could then be traced back to identify a certain person and their answers in the data set. That's a real problem, and that's where the noise infusion comes in. So we're not denigrating the accuracy of the data itself, but we are protecting the privacy of those who contribute to the data set. So what this does is move everything back to just suppression or coarsening, which are privacy protections that have been around for literally decades.
Paul Schroeder is Executive Director of the Council of Professional Associations on Federal Statistics. Mr. Schroeder, weren't there measures already in place for agencies to balance the need to protect privacy with this need to publish useful information?
Yes, there's very well documented methods and great methods that have been used for over 10 years now, and were used from the 2020 census. So differential privacy is a mathematical mechanism which is used to infuse noise, where you understand how much noise you're putting in and also what that does to the accuracy of the data. So you can mathematically calculate and find that right balance between privacy protections and having accurate data. Again, this depends on what level of data you're looking at, but it's a very robust and often used method of protecting confidentiality for the respondents. And it's being used in a lot of data sets that are being collected by the census now. And the issue with this order is that we don't know what happens to those data sets now that that is not allowed.
And your coalition also argues that this order could lead either to less privacy, less useful data, or both. So walk me through that. What is the practical outcome you're concerned about, and how might an ordinary citizen notice the difference?
The privacy protections are there in federal law. It could lead to a little less privacy. The big issue I'm worried about is having less data available. And when I say less data, I mean less usable data. So we'll still have data at the national level. We will even have it at the state level. But local communities, rural communities, these are the geographies that we're concerned about, because those are the ones that are most likely to be identifiable, because there's less people in those communities, obviously. So it's easier to find out a single person who, say, works on a farm and grows cattle versus someone who lives in the city and works in an office. So that's the problem with this order, is that certain communities will be more vulnerable to privacy breaches. But my big concern is that data simply will be suppressed and not released because of this. And that's a real concern for the American public, since they're paying for this data, and these data are relied on by businesses and researchers around the country to make real decisions and policy implications.
And a lot of your concern seems to stem from the uncertainty about implementation here. What do you know about which data products might be affected, and what are the biggest unanswered questions?
So that's the big unknown. We have had reports of certain researchers having some of their publications pulled because they used data from the census that had used differential privacy. So for one example, for a data set is the longitudinal employer household dynamics data set. This uses differential privacy. This provides information about commuting relationships between home and work. And this goes down to the census block level. So this could be something that is at risk. We haven't seen it yet, but our concern is that data sets that are using differential privacy now simply will not be updated. And we won't see the effects of this rule in terms of data quality or data recency for a good year or so.
Do you expect this approach to data privacy to spread to other critical data sets, or do you think it will be limited here to census and BEA?
It's a great question. What isn't known widely is that Census actually does a lot of data collection for other agencies as well. We're not sure if this applies to those data sets or not, because a lot of them are actually done jointly with the Census Bureau. And so that's a real concern as well. But oftentimes, the way Census goes, other statistical agencies follow that lead. We haven't seen any indications of that yet, but we've seen it on other guidelines and various data privacy rules. So it may be coming. I hesitate to speculate on it, but it's certainly possible.
And what does your group advocate for action at this point? The rule is out. It's being implemented. What do you hope happens next?
Well, we really hope people reach out to their representatives and make sure that they are aware of this change, and really make representatives aware of how this is going to affect their district. Again, these data contain within it a lot of information that has policy implications, economic development, transportation infrastructure, the health of a community. These are all very important things that folks at a district level would be very concerned about. And that's our hope, is that people reach out to the representative and also to OMB itself to hope and see what this change can be rescinded.
And for folks like you who actively use this data, what measures might you have for adapting?
Unfortunately, the immediate recourse is to use older data, which is never ideal. And so that'll work for a year or so, a year or two. But switching over to other data sets that are collected outside the federal government just isn't an option. No one has this amount of data and this amount of granularity available to researchers, and that's the real loss here.
Paul Schroeder is the Executive Director of the Council of Professional Associations on Federal Statistics. Really appreciate you joining me today and highlighting this area of concern for us.
Thank you so much, Terry. I appreciate the time.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, Washington is entering the annual sprint to the August recess. Congress still has major decisions ahead on spending, nominations, and a possible new reconciliation package. But first, artificial intelligence may be getting all the attention, but AI is only as reliable as the data behind it. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Questions about federal data have increasingly moved from the margins of government policy to the center of it. A new report argues that the United States needs a stronger national data ecosystem if it hopes to support effective decision-making, trustworthy artificial intelligence, and a well-informed public. Joining me to walk through their recommendations are Richard Coffin, Chief of Research and Advocacy at USA Facts, and Joel Gurin, President and founder of the Center for Open Data Enterprise. Joel and Richard, it is great to have both of you here with me today. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us, Terry.
Richard, I want to start with you. I bet most Americans don't think they think about federal data on a daily basis, but your new report argues that they rely on it every day. So what do you think would surprise the average American most about the role federal data plays in their daily life?
That's absolutely right, Terry. I think we look at data as really critical infrastructure for people that, you might not notice the plumbing in your house, but you definitely use it every day. And in the same way, people use government data every day. It dictates where government programs go, where spending goes. It dictates it dictates the weather, how people understand what's coming towards us. It dictates any number of things that really actually affect us on a day-to-day basis. And it's great that you mentioned that, because we're running a campaign right now about the value of data. We're trying to actually show people about that value at USA Facts, and it really does matter to people in their day-to-day lives.
And so why does that largely invisible role then make the health of federal data so important?
Yeah, it's so important because people, like you said, it's not top of mind. They don't see it, but they need it. They need it to understand the country. Government and policymakers at the federal, state, and local level need it to really decide how to create good policy that benefits the American public. We're in an election year. I think people wouldn't necessarily realize how much they rely on government data to understand via the media and via even political candidates what's going on in the country and how they want to vote. And so it is actually a critical cornerstone of our democracy. We always harken back to this James Madison quote that a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is a prologue to a tragedy or a farce, or perhaps both. And I think we really believe that without government data, without information really being shared between government and the people that elect the government, really our democracy would be in peril.
So Joel, Richards just made a compelling case for the essentiality of federal data, but your paper argues that we don't really have a national data system. We have a collection of parts and pieces. So what do you mean by that, and why don't we have a better system?
Well, you can sort of think of the federal data system as having kind of grown in bits and pieces and sort of grown, like, I don't know, oysters on a pier or something like that. There's been, the data system goes all the way back to, I think, 1790, when Thomas Jefferson started the U.S. Census, and it's grown by bits and pieces as new needs have been identified, new opportunities have come up, and so on. But one of the ways in which the U.S. is actually unique or close to it is in how we handle official federal statistics, which are, not the entire federal data system, but probably the most authoritative and the one that people think of the most. Thinking of Census, Bureau of Labor Statistics, all of that. I think there's now about 20 different statistical agencies or statistical bureaus or offices all over the federal government, as opposed to a single Office of National Statistics, which is what most countries have, if not all, except for us. So, we're really seeing, I think, what's a historical kind of artifact, but it's unfortunate because it means that it's possible for there to be duplication of different data collections. It's possible for different agencies to collect data on the same thing in different ways. It sometimes contradicts. And one of the things that we're looking at in this joint project, and by the way, it's been really a pleasure and an honor for us to be able to partner with USA Facts on this. But what USA Facts and Code and everybody we work with on this have looked at is whether part of reimagining the system should be looking at more efficient and effective ways of governing this whole thing in a more coordinated and unified way.
So if you follow the oysters on a pier metaphor, what would you propose as a more logical structure in the 21st century?
Well, I think the first place to look really is at some of the statistical offices. There have been some proposals around consolidating census and some of the other major statistical offices. Those have been around actually for, I think, a couple of decades. They've had bipartisan support, and I think they were at one point suggested in the president's budget under President Trump. I'm not sure where that proposal stands now, but I think looking at that and taking even just that one thing seriously, that one idea of consolidating 3 statistical offices into one would be a very good place to start. And then I think some of the exciting prospects ahead that we worked on in the study and talk about in the paper is the potential to begin to bring in other kinds of sources, like bringing in sources from business in a really kind of thoughtful and regulated way, or looking at how we use academic data as part of the overall data structure. So I think as we go forward, it's number one, asking if we can structure the existing offices, at least some of them, in a more coordinated way, and two, looking at how we look at these less traditional data forms and setting up the infrastructure for those as we go, so that they're working together with federal data and not side by side or even in opposition to it.
Richard, Joel's just talked about the complexity of the data environment, what's official and what's outside the federal government, and how to manage all of that. I think there's a tendency to think that AI will solve these data problems, and AI is certainly a theme in your report. But you guys seem to argue that rather than solving the problem, AI is going to expose the weaknesses in our data systems. Talk us through that.
It very much could. I think AI is interesting in that it is both something that can help and also is really one of the drivers of the urgency of why we need to be focused on better government data now. Joel mentioned the system and how it was in a bunch of pieces, and this idea of how our report doesn't necessarily take a stance on the consolidation of agencies or what the system should look like, but it does say it should do it with intentionality, and that's how we look at AI too. Is that AI really for it really to work, it must be able to train on the nation's data, and it must not just be able to access the data, but it must be able to understand the data. And I think that's the jump that we're really trying to make here, is go from data accessibility to data understandability, because there are so many challenges with the data right now that it really takes a person. I mean, I'm grateful for my job security in this situation where it takes a team of people to really understand government data well, but we need AI to be able to understand data just as well as humans do, to really be able to function well and to put the data forth to the American public in a trustworthy manner.
Joel Gerton is the president and founder of Code, and Richard Coffin is chief of research and advocacy at USA Facts. Joel, let me come back to you. The report says we're at a turning point. How much of this urgency is driven by recent political and technology disruption, and how much of it might be the result of standing structural problems that predate our current administration?
Yeah, Terry, I'm glad you said, and we said intentionally in the paper, political and technology disruptions. There's been a lot of focus on the political disruption, but I think what Richard just described about the use of AI is huge. I mean, AI is rapidly becoming the way that most Americans are going to access information if they're not already. And we know one of the things we know, for example, is that AI can hallucinate. It can tell you things with tremendous confidence that simply are not true. And if you ask it, is this true? It will say, yes, of course it is. So, figuring out so we have almost a perfect storm happening here. On the political side, the Trump administration has made a number of changes to data collection. You can debate, positives or negatives on some of those, but they have certainly shaken up the enterprise in a very significant way, while at the same time we have an AI revolution that, if nothing had changed on a single federal data set, would be disrupting the whole field. So I think when you look at the combination of those two, they cover a lot of ground, and together they really are giving us a lot of urgency. I think one of the things that is really at stake here is America's trust in data. I've seen some statistics since we put out this paper, actually, that only about half of Americans really trust federal statistics, and it may actually be a smaller number who have strong confidence in American statistics. Now, that's still a higher percentage than trust, social media or the news media or other things. But we definitely are in a situation where, with the combination of these political and technological forces, we could see a lot of people simply losing trust in what the government says. And that would be, I think, really a tragedy, and one that could be hard to come back from. So it's really a question of meeting the moment and addressing these changes in a really coherent, sensible, programmatic way. Exactly what USA Facts does, what Code tries to do, what many, many of our colleagues, because there are now dozens of great organizations working on this issue. Collectively, we really need to keep a clear head and help the public as well sort through what's going on.
And Richard, did you want to add on?
Yeah, just to add on to what Joel was saying about both the opportunity and the urgency is that, when we look back at our current fragmented federal data system, it really grew up by accident, right? So many pieces of it came to be at different parts, and we've sort of collectively put them together as a data system. And it works, but it's incomplete. And it's been hard for groups like ours, like Code and like USA Facts, to really make that shift because of the way things have been. And what AI is doing is giving us an opportunity where people are saying, what are the rules? We need to write new rules. And if everybody goes out and writes different rules, the federal government, state and local governments, different agencies do something different in terms of AI data readiness, is only going to exacerbate the problem we currently have. And so that's why we really view there's an urgency of now to tackle this problem.
And that seems to bring us back to a central governance mechanism for the national data system. Joel, let me close with you. You gathered input from more than 150 stakeholders in preparing this report, and you ended up with 7 major goals. So rather than go through all of those, just tell me, if listeners remember one thing from this report, what's the most important step we should take to build the data ecosystem that you described?
I would say, in my mind, the most important step is to be able to take a big look at big issues. And we've heard this from many of those 150 people who were involved in this project as participants in our roundtables and in other ways, that people who are really close to this issue, who work with the data, they don't want to just see a little bit of incremental change around the edges or incremental remedies around the edges on a system that grew up sort of edge by edge and piece by piece. I think there's a very strong and widely held belief that it's time to take a look at the whole system, to look at how these new forces are really either threatening it or opening new opportunities. So I would say big picture thinking is going to be the most important thing to come out of this, in my mind.
I've been speaking with Joel Gerton, the president and founder of Code, and Richard Coffin, chief of research and advocacy at USA Facts. Thank you both so much for the time today and for this report.
Thank you, Terry.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
We'll post this interview and a link to their report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, Washington is entering the annual sprint to the August recess. Congress still has major decisions ahead on spending, nominations, and a possible new reconciliation package. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. As lawmakers look toward the August recess, several of the year's biggest policy debates remain unresolved. Budget issues, pending nominees, and early discussions about another reconciliation bill are all competing for attention on Capitol Hill. Here with an update on where things stand is Lauren Duggan, Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, great to have you back. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
It is not a slow summer yet, and last week the president gave a national address. Let's not get into the particulars of what he said, but it was really an effort to rally support for the SAVE Act. So let's start there. Do you think it had its intended effect in Congress?
The dynamics around the Save America Act, as he has called it at times too, it seems stuck. The House has passed a version of it that had two of the things he's asked for, which is the voter ID provision and the proof of citizenship before you register to vote provision. The mail-in ballots has not gone through the House. The Senate had a debate around some of those issues, but as we know, it got stuck on them. It has not moved forward. There does not appear to be the 60 votes you would need to pass that legislation. And as he's called for, there doesn't seem to be the votes to end the filibuster or make some change there. Now, proponents of that, like Senator Mike Lee, who's been a big backer of the Save America Act and also a big backer of staying on the Senate floor to talk about it as long as possible, he obviously had immediate posts on X about this is proof that we need to deal with this legislation and get it through. So we'll see as lawmakers return if that has changed the dynamics. But for a long time, they've seemed pretty locked as where they were before a couple of months ago. So.
And that is now having effects in some of the other funding legislation. So the House brought out its Reconciliation 3.0 blueprint, and SAVE was in and around that. What do we know about the blueprint, and how does this SAVE Act affect it?
Yeah, SAVE has gotten attached or talked about being attached to multiple pieces of legislation, with proponents in the House saying we need to send the Senate this any way we can to try to force them to accept it. On the reconciliation front, what we saw last week is the House Budget Committee approve a resolution, which is the first step in this process, saying to the House Administration Committee, give us $10 billion worth of spending related to things under your jurisdiction, which is going to be grants around some of these questions. That's different than the SAVE Act, but they're trying to do whatever they can to push that SAVE Act legislation in there. When you get to the Senate with the eventual bill, they have that Byrd rule that we've talked about probably in the past that limits what can be included in a reconciliation bill. It's supposed to be budget related, not supposed to be strict policy. And that language could run into like a buzzsaw into the parliamentarian or into a situation there. So people who are pushing for reconciliation for some of this even admit that they're not likely to get the whole thing in there just because of the rules and the dynamic around that policy.
Well, let's keep pulling on the Recon 3.0 thread for a minute, because they are running out of runway to get this through in time. And there seems to be a lot of contention, even in the House, about what the final provisions will be. So what's likely to happen next with this, at least over the next week or so?
If the House can adopt this resolution, the first step, they'll send it over to the Senate, and it's unclear, are they going to take that up right away at all? Will it meet their needs? Because this has, I think, around $60 billion for defense, another maybe 13 for intelligence programs, and then some agricultural language in there. And this is just step one, saying committees give us that language. It doesn't even have the specifics yet. That doesn't include the money that the president asked for to be part of his $1.5 trillion defense top line. That was supposed to include action and reconciliation. That's not there. There aren't offsets, which some members have said they may like to see in both chambers. And when we're talking about the sort of narrow majorities you have in the House and the Senate, 1, 2, 3, 4 members pushing for something could be enough to cause a problem. So, this is far from locked in at this point. They're not as aligned on this at this stage as they were on the One Big Beautiful Bill or even that Homeland Security funding bill that was done through reconciliation. It seems like they're still building support and consensus. But if they can get this to the floor of the House and over the line, that will be a step, and we'll see what happens from there.
Lauren Duggan is Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, let's go back to the first part of the Recon 3.0 that you mentioned, the defense supplemental. That itself is spurring a whole lot of different kinds of conversations. It keeps bringing up, well, do we want to approve money for the operation in Iran that we maybe do or do not support? And it's having implications on the NDAA. Kind of walk us through how all of those dots are getting connected.
Yeah, the defense funding picture and policy picture has been pretty complicated. On the NDAA front, they've talked about trying to get that done maybe before they leave for their August recess in the House. The Senate last week had a procedural vote, couldn't get enough support to even get the bill on the floor because of the Iran dynamics, the war that was kind of concluded and then resumed. And we've seen a lot of votes around the War Powers Resolution trying to curtail that. It's going to be hard not to talk about Iran in NDAA should that come up. The supplemental itself is to provide funding to make up for some of what has been spent in the operations to date. And So it's hard to avoid the Iran question when you're providing funding related to Iran. So I do think that is going to feed into the debate and continue to as they figure out what to do moving forward, and then get to the appropriations picture, which they have to deal with that later as well. So a lot to talk about there on defense and Iran.
And at the end of last week, Speaker Johnson said he wanted to try to do a continuing resolution early on. And so my mind just boggles at trying to get all of that through, but that's kind of a different take. What's he trying to propose there?
The idea here is to lock in government funding past September 30th. The way that text is written is going to be key to whether lawmakers can support it on both sides of the aisle. I think that he might have a right flank to deal with on the Republicans, and if he loses a significant chunk of Republicans, then he might need some Democratic support. And how do you get that? But if they could, in July, have a piece of paper over in the Senate that says, don't shut down the government, basically, because we'll fund it, then that would be a potential way to avoid that dynamic in September when they come back. But the details are going to matter. If there's a pill in there or a provision that Democrats see as a poison pill, they may not want to back it. We'll have to see if it's language that will make the Senate happy, where you do need 60 votes likely to get that over the line. So again, the details are going to matter on the CR and what it says, how long it runs, and what might get attached to it.
Well, obviously, the funding bills are at the top of our list, but there were a number of hearings last week, confirmation hearings, that also play into other sorts of legislation that might or might not move forward. There were 2 hearings for folks in Health and Human Services, the CDC director, the administrator for strategic preparedness. We had Jay Clayton and we had Todd Blanche on the Hill. So walk us through the hot takes from those confirmation hearings and what the implications might be for related legislation.
Yes, and another one we were watching was Keith Sunderland to be the labor secretary. So there are these key vacancies they're trying to fill. Jay Clayton for Director of National Intelligence is one that had a direct tie to legislation, because the FISA provisions that expired several weeks ago, his confirmation as the full-time DNI, replacing Bill Pulte as the temporary DNI, had been seen as key to that. He was scheduled for a hearing several weeks ago, was pulled back by the White House. They canceled that, and they resumed that last week. Democrats had some negative things to say about him afterwards, and some tough questions during the session. So we'll see what the confirmation picture looks like for him. There may be the 50 votes they would need to confirm him, get him over the line. Maybe that opens up FISA, but we'll have to see. On the CDC front, obviously, healthcare policy has been top of mind for a number of lawmakers, vaccine policy, things like that, tough questions around that. And then when it comes to Todd Blanche, he faced questions around some of the things with the Epstein files and other matters, and his relationship with the president and what that means being attorney general. And we'll have to see if he's got the votes on side there to move those forward. Something we're wondering is they still have to fill some committee slots from the death of Senator Graham, and then they're still working in some committees through Mitch McConnell's absence as he continues to recover from his health challenges there. So having all the people in place to move those forward will be key, because in some of these committees, one vote is enough to prevent things from moving forward. Judiciary, Lindsey Graham was on that, so they need to be fully constituted to get that over the line. But I could see John Thune, the majority leader, making a big push before they leave in a couple of weeks to get these over the line and in place.
There was one more set of hearings I would love to get your take on. Russ Vought was on the Hill last week a couple of times. What did you hear? Any tough questions about the 2027 budget, the administration's approach to impoundment? Those have been recurring issues when Mr. Vought is on the Hill.
Yeah, I mean, the hearings he were up there for were nominally about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which he's the acting head of, and but they take opportunities when you're up there to ask you questions. So yeah, he did face some tough questions. I think lawmakers always have some thoughts about what's been going on at OMB and asking about those. So that's been a kind of tense relationship between the Hill and Russ Vought. I'm assuming that will continue as he continues in maybe his dual roles or multiple roles up there on OMB. But yeah, a little bit of a tough hearing here for him.
Lauren Duggan is the Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, we'll keep our fingers crossed that some of this gets across the line before they go on recess. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Pentagon has kicked off its review of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program. Defense officials plan to hold listening sessions across the country to hear about compliance concerns. But questions continue to swirl around what exactly the Pentagon can do differently this time to balance small business cost concerns with the need to enforce cyber requirements. For the latest, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now. Justin, what are you hearing about how this review is kicking off and what people are expecting?
Well, the review officially kicked off on Thursday, July 16th. That is when the CMMC review team met for the first time. DoD Chief Information Officer Kirsten Davies told reporters a little bit about the review during a tour of the factory floor at K-Form, which is a small defense manufacturer based in Sterling, Virginia. And Davies, of course, has been the driving force behind the suspension of the CMMC third-party assessment requirements in this 60-day review. She says that Davies wants to hear back from small businesses. The DoD is going to hold listening sessions across the country to get feedback from defense contractors across the country. DoD has also published a request for information last week to get feedback on the CMMC review. And during the tour at K-Form, Davies said that she kind of doesn't want to wait around to implement any potential recommendations that come from the review. She said the review, of course, is going to take about 60 days, and then she'll give the team 15 days to provide a report with recommendations to herself and Pentagon Acquisition Chief Michael Duffy. So that timeline would put us at the end of September to kind of see this review come out. And that would be interesting because, of course, the third-party certification requirements were set to go into effect November 10th. And DoD has suspended those in name, but they actually haven't changed any regulations at this point. And so we will see how exactly they go about quickly implementing the results of the review. But, of course, right now we are on the front end.
Do we have any sense of what Davies and her team expect or want to come out of this review?
Yeah, I was trying to get a sense of that when we were able to ask her questions at K-Form on Thursday, and I couldn't quite tell exactly where this could be going. And I think Davies does not want to get ahead of her team too far because a lot of this is focused on small business compliance costs. That's why we were touring a small defense manufacturer as part of some of these announcements. And really, both Davies and Pentagon Acquisition Chief Michael Duffy, who were there, really were critical of how the third-party certification process in CMMC has become, quote, red tape and compliance. And you've seen them throughout this past week really be critical of that whole process and how it was going to, in their view, force a lot of companies out of the defense industrial base. But Davies did not go so far as to say the third-party certification requirements are done and that they're going to turn away from those. That could be the result of this review, but she's not getting ahead of that quite yet. And she said that DoD needs to be more creative in how it helps defense industrial-based companies meet cybersecurity requirements. So we'll see how they look at that as well, because that's something that a lot of folks have looked at in the past too.
How could the department move quickly to implement the results of this review once they get them in?
Yeah, it's interesting. DoD spent years developing the rules around CMMC, both the CMMC program rule, which was finalized in November 2024, and then the CMMC contracting requirements, which were finalized last year. And now you have this really fast review and potentially quick implementation. I spoke with Sandeep Kathuria, a partner at the law firm Saul Ewing, about how quickly the department might be able to move to implement any proposed changes from this review. And he said that, DoD could use class deviations to change how they implement or don't implement the CMMC requirements moving forward. They could also do interim rules. And that's all to say, too, that this administration has, moved very quickly on a lot of regulatory changes, not just cybersecurity, but kind of across the board when it comes to acquisition.
We'll have to see what comes out of the policy review and the responses to the RFI. There also is, of course, the possibility to do interim rules that would change the DFARS. That's another tool that's available to the department. We have seen in many areas that this administration can move very quickly to make regulatory changes.
Justin, you mentioned that the Defense Department took almost a decade to write these CMMC rules. Why do they think that this review will generate something different than its past assessments of the CMMC program?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question here. I think it was just 5 years ago that the Biden administration, the new Biden administration at that time, actually launched its own review of the program, and that review was largely motivated by concerns over small business compliance costs. Remember, we were coming out of kind of the pandemic there in 2021. The defense industrial base, the small defense contractors who for decades had been kind of squeezed, were really squeezed during that period. And there was a lot of concern then that CMMC would just kind of be that another hurdle to small businesses either entering or just sticking around in the defense industrial base. And so what came out of that review in 2021 was DoD simplifying the CMMC standards, not layering on any additional cybersecurity standards beyond the NIST standards that were already in place, and then actually reducing the number of companies that would be required to have a third-party certification, and reintroducing the idea of self-assessment for less sensitive types of information. So that's how DoD has moved forward over the last 5 years. But there was still this big third-party certification component because, as we had seen in the past, DoD had found that companies were not actually complying with the cybersecurity requirements, but they were just required to self-attest to meeting them. And so companies would kind of check the box on the contract, say, yes, we were doing this, but in fact, they were not. And that came out in several reports, including an inspector general audit around the 2019 timeframe. And so that's why CMMC was created in the first place. And now you're kind of seeing, at least initially during this review, a suspension of third-party certification and a return to self-attestation. I spoke with Kate Growley. She is a partner at the law firm Crowell and Mooring about that.
If the DOW concluded that it was in the DIB's best interest to rely more heavily on self-assessment than the original CMMC 2.0 had envisioned, it would be a notable return to the original system that the DOW said was insufficient and that necessitated the creation of CMMC 1.0.
Justin, what are you hearing about the accuracy of the data that DoD is referencing as it kicks off this review?
Yeah, this is something I'm watching closely as well, because we have seen a couple big claims from DoD to kind of set the groundwork for this review. One is just the number of cybersecurity assessors that both Davies and Duffy and others have referenced a, quote, severe shortage of cybersecurity assessors available to do these third-party assessments. And they said that was another barrier for small businesses because they couldn't find assessors. Now, the organization in charge of overseeing those assessors, the Cyber Accreditation Body, is kind of quietly pushing back against those claims. They put out a statement. They said that they are surprised and disappointed in the pause, but they are confident that there will be continued and measurable progress for CMMC and that there is absolute criticality for third-party verification. And they also put out some numbers here. They said that they have over 1,000 CMMC certified assessors. Those are individual people who can go out and certify companies, and they have 110 authorized CMMC third-party assessment organizations. Even though the third-party certification requirements aren't enforced yet, they said they've done nearly 2,000 level 2 certifications, third-party certifications already. And so the Cyber Accreditation Body, I think you'll see them kind of say, hey, we've been building up this capacity to be able to meet the demand. And, there isn't a severe shortage of assessors at this point. And then quickly, the other big thing is just the costs. I think we've seen Small Business Administration Administrator Kelly Loeffler reference $500,000 in compliance costs for CMMC as a big barrier for small businesses. But I spoke with Eric Crucius. He's a partner at the law firm Hunton Andrews Kurth, and he talked about how people can often conflate the cost of implementing the actual cybersecurity standards with just the pure CMMC certification costs.
When you have a third party that has to come in and do an assessment, all of a sudden it does cause a company to go, okay, what are we really doing versus what did we think we were doing? So all of a sudden the cost for CMMC seems really high because oftentimes there is a catch-up process where some security controls have to be put into place that weren't there before. I think that causes a lot of conflation with the cost of CMMC versus the cost of compliance and kind of mixing those two together.
And again, that's Eric Crucius, a partner at the law firm Hunton Andrews Kurth. So I will be watching those debates over just the data around this program, the costs, the number of assessors. I think that's going to become an interesting theme during the 60-day review.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for keeping us up to date. This is a hot topic.
You got it. Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.